Today, I'm very happy to have back with us, Matt Gonzalez is here today. Right here.
Thank you.
Matt was a supervisor in San Francisco and then ran for mayor against Gavin Newsom and ran an incredibly tight race, lost by just a few percent in spite of being outspent by many, many times, 6 to 8 times what he spent, and ended up running a very tight race. He then left politics, has been practicing law in San Francisco in recent years, and then got the call everyone's waiting for, from Ralph Nader to become his running mate in the 2008 presidential campaign. So he is running for vice president of the United States on the independent ticket. How about that? So, if a plane should crash that's holding McCain, Clinton, and Obama, you are looking at the next Vice President of the United States, Matt Gonzalez.
Yeah. Do I need that? No, great. I had a reporter ask me about being the vice president and wanted to know what my qualifications were, and I said, well, if Dan Quayle and Dick Cheney can do it, I'm sure I can manage it. Let me tell you a little bit about how this came about, because I think there's a lot going on. Excuse me? Yeah. There's a lot going on in American politics right now. There's a lot of excitement about this particular campaign, and there are a lot of people that are responding to the thought of a Nader candidacy with some concern. And so my own decision-making in terms of how I went about kind of looking at this and trying to figure out what it was all about, I did what I think a lot of people are doing right now, trying to look at the other candidates. You know, Nader is somebody that in my adult lifetime and even before has been known for instituting so much change at the national level. His name is associated with so many important laws, from the Freedom of Information Act or seatbelt laws or Clean Air Act and things like that. His Senate record would be the envy of any U.S. senator. And yet somehow when he enters a political contest, people sort of freak out about it. And they're scared of it because of how he is blamed for the outcome in the election of 2000. When I started looking at the other candidates, I was quite taken with a lot of the rhetoric I was hearing from the Obama campaign, and him in particular. And I realized I didn't know very much about him. And so I started looking into it. I knew he had given an important speech at the Democratic National Convention. I knew that he had been elected to the United States Senate in Illinois, and he beat a fellow named Alan Keyes, who didn't even live in the state when he announced his candidacy because another candidate had dropped out. So it really wasn't much of a contest. But when I started looking at Obama's voting record, I became very concerned because while the rhetoric was really strong about change and about changing the culture in Washington, I realized that his voting record didn't support that whatsoever. And it really gave me some alarm. I saw that even one blogger went so far as to say he speaks like Martin Luther King, but he votes like G.W. Bush. Now, those are strong words, I thought. You know, there was a recent article in the Chronicle last week about the oil companies appearing before Congress. They're making more money than they've ever made before, and oil prices are higher and higher. I think it was ExxonMobil claimed profits higher than any company in the history of the United States at $40 billion. And the vice president of that company, I think his name is Stephen Simon, was in front of Congress, and he was actually talking about how if we want to bring oil prices down, we should really allow drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge or that area. And it's incredible that these corporate leaders are willing to walk into a legislature for this country and do that. And you think, how could they possibly think that they're going to get away with that? And of course, it's because they have historically over and over again. Do you know that in 2005, the Energy Policy Act that was before the United States Senate that gave enormous giveaways to oil companies, tax breaks, subsidies, etc., was on the table. And John Kerry voted against it. Hillary Clinton voted against it. John McCain voted against it. Barack Obama voted for it. There was a thing called the Class Action Reform Act that came before the United States Senate. This was a Republican extravaganza, big business extravaganza. This is all about taking lawsuits out of state courts and putting them into federal court, where you have a Republican judiciary and where you have a harder time certifying classes. So all those wage and hour cases involving Walmart and wages and breaks, all those cases tried to make it in the federal courts. They got shot down. They were eventually certified in the state courts, and that's where all this good law is coming out of. Well, naturally, Republicans and big business wanted to do away with this, and so they came up with this thing called the Class Action Reform Act. Well, John Kerry voted against it. Hillary Clinton voted against it. Barack Obama voted for it. There were probably about 22, 23, 24 Democrats that held the line and voted against it. Universally, it was criticized. This was not something that was a close call. The writers at The Nation, they all said this was just a total, essentially, giveaway. I mean, it was just everybody knew what this was about. There are a lot of other troubling votes that I started coming across. There's this old law called the Mining Act. I think it's 1872. And Ralph Nader and I have spoken about this years ago, and he used it as an example of how messed up Congress is. He says, this is a law that got passed when Ulysses Grant was president, and it was for the prospector who put the pickaxe over his shoulder and went out. And what the law says is you pay $2.50 to $5 per acre of public lands that we own collectively. And that's what you pay the government. And then you're allowed to take anything you get out of the land, any hard rock mineral, copper, gold, whatever it is. Okay, this law is outdated now, right? You got multinational corporations, many of them based out of Canada, doing this prospecting, if you will. And they're only paying these royalties, although their profit margins are easily in the tens of millions of dollars a year. I mean, this is just... It's just an incredible giveaway. And because they put this money into lobbying, I have some notes with me from an article I wrote about this to give you the exact numbers. It's estimated that they spent $60 million between 1998 and 2004, according to the Center on Public Integrity, which oversees the lobbying efforts of this group. $60 million to keep this law in place. Well, the House of Representatives finally got to a place where they said, we got to stop this because we ought to be getting royalty off of this. And the incredible thing is, not only did these companies only pay $2.50 to $5 for this right, but they could leave the empty hole behind, and then taxpayer monies had to go and clean up these mines. So Congress finally passes a Reform Act. If you build a new mine, you would pay 8% royalty to the federal government. An old pre-existing mine would pay 4%. Barack Obama proudly, while campaigning in the western states, said he was against this law, and then Clinton joined him in that rhetoric. Now, you can look into this. You can look into this stuff. It's all out there. The Energy Policy Act was repealed a couple of years later. But it says something about a candidate that can stand in front of you and repeatedly say, I'm going to change the culture of Washington. I'm going to change what's going on there, without giving you an accounting of what is going on here. What are these votes about? There are other issues we can talk about. The New York Times ran a story in February of this year, and they ran a story about Senator Obama's claims that he had passed positive legislation against the nuclear industry, which, by the way, was a big beneficiary under the 2005 Energy Policy Act that he had voted for. There was a company in Illinois called Exelon that runs nuclear power plants, and they had a little problem where there was a leak happening at their plant that wasn't disclosed to any of the neighbors. Naturally, they were upset. Naturally, they went to petition their congressman, their senator, and Obama introduced legislation that was going to mandate immediate reporting of these kinds of leaks. The New York Times, story, February 3rd, 2008, talked to some of the people that worked with Senator Obama's office, and they said every time they saw a new version of the bill, it got weaker and weaker. Ultimately, it was incredible because the teeth were taken out of it, and basically instead of mandating reporting of leaks, it became voluntary guidelines for what regulators, federal regulators, should do in the event of a leak to decide whether or not to disclose. And although Senator Obama had campaigned saying he had passed this law and helped regulate this industry, the truth is it had never passed. I don't even know if it had come up to a vote, but it had never taken effect. There are other troubling issues here, and I'm picking on Senator Obama. I'm quite aware of it because your professor has told me that this is a pretty strong Obama crowd, and I think that it's interesting that when I enter a contest with somebody like Ralph Nader, we get into it and people are upset at us. They're angry at us for, how dare you enter this contest? How dare you do these things? How dare you jeopardize the victory? He's to blame for Iraq. He's to blame for all these things. And it's incredible how a single man who, on the one hand, the Democrats want to trivialize because he doesn't get any support, could somehow hold the entire nation hostage. Isn't that an odd narrative that we're expected to buy into, that this guy just, oh my God, one person in the United States just has the capacity to do that? Isn't that odd? One of the things I did when I became an elected representative in San Francisco was that I got the city to adopt a type of voting that mandates majority elections with one trip to the ballot box. So if you think about it, we do a lot of elections in this country where we let the winner be whoever got the most votes. And we just say, the election's over. This person got the most, 40%, they're the elected person, right? They take office. Well, if you think about it, the only reason that kind of voting was ever accepted is because I would think that in maybe 19th century United States, where the idea of conducting an election was so difficult and people had to travel so far to get to a polling place, that you would just do it for the sake of technology, really. But the thought that we still engage in this exercise in the 21st century is just astounding to me. In San Francisco, what we do is you go to the ballot and you vote your choices. You tell us who your favorite candidate is, but you tell us what your second and third preference is. And by collecting your preference at that moment, we can conduct a runoff without asking you to come back and vote again. And so we know that the winner of those contests is going to have a majority of the vote. This is really simple. I mean, this is used to elect the president of Ireland. It's used to elect the mayor of London. It's used in countless races in Australia. And the question is, why isn't it used in the United States? Well, after 2000, if you think about the way the Democratic narrative goes, the Democrats lost the presidency because Ralph Nader took votes away from Al Gore in Florida. But how could 8 years have gone by without some kind of election reform that would simply make that impossible? So it could not happen. What I can tell you, in 2004, I think it was shortly after we voted on what we call instant runoff voting measure in San Francisco. The same kind of voting measure was in front of the Alaska voters. And you know what? The Democratic Party in Alaska opposed the measure, even though it would have applied to federal races, presidential, Senate races, etc. And it was kind of baffling to many of us. The other thing that's quite interesting, as I look more and more at this, I see that the Democrats have actually been the beneficiaries of this kind of voting before, where because there's a third-party candidate, they're able to win an election that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to win. And the most recent example of that, I think, is 1992, when Bill Clinton got elected president, because there was a fellow named Ross Perot that spoiled it for Bush Sr. Do you realize that Bill Clinton got 43% of the vote, substantially less than G.W. Bush got as a percentage? And yet I've never walked into a room and heard any Democrat complain about Perot. If you go back the last 100 years, you're going to see that it's a recurring reality of American politics, of the last 24 presidential races, that 8 of them have a winner declared who didn't get a majority of the vote because there were other candidates running. The most, I think the earliest in that lot is, I think, the 1904 election. I think it's the one where, was it 04? Was it 19? When did Woodrow Wilson run? 1912, that's the election. He was a two-termer, and in 1912, he got elected. You know why? He won. He ran against an incumbent Republican president, but a former Republican president ran with a new party, an independent party, I think the Bull Moose Party, Teddy Roosevelt, and he ended up winning, and he got 2 terms. And Bill Clinton never had a majority of the vote. And, you know, when I think Kennedy beat Nixon, I don't think he had over a majority of the vote. There are a lot of these recurring realities that happen. But it's not just limited to the presidential contest. It goes into other contests as well. Right now, the United States Senate is divided with essentially 51 Democrats to 49 Republicans. And of course, in the Democratic category, we include Lieberman, who's not much of a Democrat these days, from Connecticut, and we include Bernie Sanders, who says he's a socialist, progressive, independent. But nevertheless, it's a 51-49 Lieberman caucuses with the Democrats. Did you know that there are 4 U.S. senators who are all Democrats serving right now who won their contests because libertarians spoiled the contest for Republicans? One of them is Harry Reid, the Democratic leader. It's really incredible. In 1998, Reid beat a fellow named John Ensign by 428 votes. And the Libertarian candidate, Michael Cloud, got over 8,000 votes. And the natural law candidate got nearly 3,000 votes. And both of those parties split far more in favor of the Republicans than they do Democrats. Or you take Maria Cantwell from Washington. She won her Senate seat in 2000 by beating Republican Slade Gordon by 2,229 votes. The Libertarian candidate, Jeff Jarrett, won over 64,000 votes. Are you with me? Senator Tim Johnston, South Dakota, to Senator John Tester from Montana. So even with this advantage, this benefit that the Democrats have gotten from the spoiler problem, what do we know about them? They've continued to vote for things like the war in Iraq. They've continued to vote for war appropriations, the Patriot Act, et cetera, et cetera. And so some of us, like Ralph Nader and myself and those that support our candidacy, they look at this and they say, this is not an opposition party. This is not a party that's holding the line and doing very much for us. This is not a party that is exhibiting the kind of courage that we need right now. And it's not a party that's sufficiently expanding the very narrow area in which we do politics in this country. Senator Obama's signature position against the war is a very interesting one to look at, because while we can applaud a state senator from Illinois coming out against the war in Iraq, and we can say that that's a good thing, it's very interesting that once he is in office and has the power to actually cast a meaningful vote, he has elected not to do so. He's voted for every war appropriation. He voted for the Patriot Act, easily the worst attack on American civil liberties in the last half century. He voted to allow Condoleezza Rice to be Secretary of State, despite her complicity in George Bush's, phony reasons for going to war in the Middle East. Why would you do that? Think to yourself, why would you do that if you're against the war and if you believe that the whole thing was a sham and these were the architects of that? And there were others, Democrats, that had the courage to say no and vote against that. There were other Democrats who were willing to change the culture of Washington in the votes, not in the rhetoric, but in the actual vote. There are other concerns. He went and campaigned for Joseph Lieberman, who had a tight race for U.S. Senate in Connecticut against Ned Lamont. And Obama went there and he called Lieberman his mentor. And in a dinner there with Ned Lamont present, he told people to vote for Lieberman. He went out of his way to vote for a U.S. senator who has been called Bush's closest ally in the war in Iraq, and someone who is now endorsing John McCain. When I first got into this contest with Ralph Nader, there were a lot of angry people. There were a lot of people that said, what the hell are you doing in this contest? You know, the Democrats want to end the war. You guys are going to jeopardize that. And I said, well, actually, they don't want to end the war. You're not listening to them if you're reaching that conclusion. And we started looking at it and breaking it down. And it was very interesting what we saw. Saying that you want to leave 150,000 private soldiers in Iraq is not pulling troops out of Iraq. Saying that you're going to pull out combat troops, but maybe redeploy them in Afghanistan, and then saying that, don't worry, though, we're going to have enough of a presence to strike out against al-Qaeda, to do counterterrorism and counterinsurgency there. There is a Democratic think tank led by John Podesta called the Center for American Progress. Podesta was the chief of staff under President Clinton. He's not some, radical lefty Ralph Nader guy. He is firmly in the Democratic Party. He said, listening to Obama's rhetoric, in order to do the things that he wants to do about striking al-Qaeda and all this, it's going to take at least 60,000 troops there. We have to listen to what the candidates say. We have to, and if you want to vote for Obama, you should vote for him. But I think that before you cast that vote, you should ask that candidate to tell you why he's voted the way he has on these issues. Make him account to you before you vote for him, because if you don't, what are you rewarding? You're rewarding somebody that votes badly. You're telling them that you're not going to ask them what their history is if they talk good. And I would be willing to say right now, I've seen a lot of political candidates in my day. I've done politics against Nancy Pelosi and Willie Brown and Dianne Feinstein. I've been there and done politics and negotiated, legislation in San Francisco. The budget in San Francisco is larger than that of some states, okay? You reward bad or the absence of reform when you participate in any kind of critique of Ralph Nader or Matt Gonzalez for entering this contest. If we had a voting system that were fair, you would welcome Ralph Nader into this contest. You'd say, oh my God, finally somebody that's talking the truth about the need to, control corporations and do something about corporate personhood and institute real reforms. But because we don't have the reform that the parties won't let you have, who's benefited by the attack and the critique? Don't you see? I mean, to me, it seems so obvious, particularly as I get older. I just say, you know what? You're throwing your vote away when you vote for those candidates because you're telling them that you're going to help prop up their system. You're going to keep it in place because you're going to accept that all the minds in the Democratic Party couldn't get it straight and come up with a solution to this thing that happened in 2000, but they can't fix it after 8 years. All those great minds. Well, if they can't fix that, Do you think they can get you out of the war in Iraq? Do you think that they're going to institute meaningful reform of any kind? Do you think that they're going to change the culture of Washington? Do you see the way it goes on and on? The issue about Iraq is also very, very central to, I think, what the American people are focused on. And I think it's important that while we assess the kind of anti-war sentiment that's happening and the willingness now that the war has gone poorly for U.S. senators to join forces and to want to deal with a certain kind of rhetoric around it, we have to ask ourselves, would we want this kind of foreign policy if the war was going great, right? And a lot of people don't want to engage in that. They don't want to have a reevaluation of what it is that got us there in the first place. There are other issues we could talk about, other votes and other positions. Nader's a strong supporter of single-payer health care. He's been talking about this for over a decade. He's been way out in front trying to get Americans to realize that they do it differently in other countries and it works in other countries. And of course, he's been a very strong enemy to the kinds of free trade agreements like CAFA and NAFTA that have hurt American workers and allowed some American products that, in particular, let's say corn, where you have strong subsidies in the United States, compete against Mexican farmers, undercut their prices because we are subsidizing our product and then forcing those workers in Mexico to lose their livelihood, move north to work in a maquiladora phenomena, etc. I think there's a lot of excitement this year over elections. I'm glad to see it. I'm proud to see it. I'm glad to see people involved. I respect your right to vote for who you want to. I respect your right to not vote for Ralph Nader. But I hope that some of my remarks today will maybe make you reassess where you may be and maybe force you to ask some hard questions that maybe you weren't aware of, or maybe to do further inquiry. And I hope that you will reflect on what it is in a country such as ours to fight this kind of battle, and these battles have been fought many times in the last decades in this country. I imagine, what was it like when Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate of the early 20th century who never got more than 5 or 6% when he ran, right? People said, if you vote for him, you're throwing your vote away. Imagine what it was like when Debs walked into a room of men and said women should be allowed to vote. And maybe 5 out of 100 thought, yeah, that was a good idea. Imagine what that was like. And imagine if somebody had stood in that room and told those people, oh, you're throwing your vote away if you vote for Eugene Debs. Your vote, that's silly, don't do that. We got another contest over here between Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt and this Republican president, et cetera, et cetera. Don't you see? You have to think about some of those historical realities. We got to a certain place because people like Ralph Nader fought for it and are willing to take on the wrath of the opposition. In 2004, the Democratic Party went all out against Nader's effort to get on the ballot in many states. I don't have a problem with requiring a candidate to get, signatures, valid signatures to get on the ballot. But there was all kinds of subterfuge happening. Signature gatherers would be paid not to turn in signatures. There was a lot of just stuff like that going on. In Pennsylvania, there was a challenge to Nader signatures. And not only did they invalidate the signatures so that he couldn't get on the ballot, but you know what they did? They gave him a bill for $100,000, him and Peter Camejo, his running mate. They basically said, okay, you submitted signatures, we've reviewed them and decided they're not good, and you owe us $100,000. What do you think that does in a democracy to people that are going to try to run for office and submit signatures to get on the ballot? By the way, I believe Pennsylvania, I could be wrong, but I believe that's the state that if you run as one of the major parties and you try to get on the ballot with signatures, it's like under 5,000 signatures. If you're an independent, you got to get, I don't know, 50,000 or something. But even putting aside that inequality, imagine what it is to have a state Supreme Court saying you can give this bill, you know, this cost to check these signatures to a candidate. Do you think it silences speech and political participation? You know, I think it does. So I'm going to stop there, take questions from you. Thank you for the invitation, and it's good to be here. Thank you. Well, there are a couple of things there that you say that I'm not going to agree with. First of all, yeah, I think you said that you're a supporter of instant runoff voting, but given the fact that it doesn't exist, we're not going to win this contest. And I think you were wondering how our campaign is going to further the cause of instant runoff voting. You know, one of the reasons I decided to run with Nader was because I knew that I would be talking about election reform, and I had a history of actually instituting that kind of reform. And so I think it's already gotten a lot more press than it would have. But I think it's a mistake to believe that the success of political candidacies is only based on whether or not they can win. I'm not suggesting you said that. Some people feel that way. But more importantly, why is it that you conclude that we cannot win the contest? Both Senators Obama and Senator McCain at different times in this very election were at percentage points in the single digits. And when I ran for mayor, the very first polling, although I was president of the Board of Supervisors, had me at lower numbers than Nader starts with. He starts with 5 or 6% in polls that include him. When you have multiple candidates running, the winner can win that contest with, I mean, it's not because we want it this way, we want majority outcomes, but the winner can win the contest with less than 40% of the vote. And I wonder whether or not our support would grow if we were allowed into the debates. Do you think we might go from 5 to 10% or 5 to 15%? And what if we were at that number? Wouldn't it be a completely different dynamic? Well, you're asking me to engage in some. No, I understood the question. I got the question. I just, since I'm not a Democrat, I mean, I sort of don't think that we should elect a president or nominate somebody in a political party with the whole superdelegate phenomena anyway. If you're asking me the separate question, which is somebody who is in a seat wherein the power of that seat is that you can vote for anybody that you want to, then the question is, what rules are you supposed to consider when you cast that vote? Presumably, these superdelegates are supposed to assess the viability of the candidates in the general election, things like that. What do you think? Yeah. But why do you say that? Couldn't it be just as easy? I mean, in Texas, where I'm from, they have a system where they award some delegates by who went and voted, and then they award some delegates through a caucus system, which favors people that are more active, maybe younger, who can go to these, have the time to go, etc. I mean, we don't look at that and say, well, that's inherently unfair to a certain class of people. Those just happen to be the rules, and you know. I think in her case, the fact that she's willing to engage anybody and say you can change your vote, well, her pledged delegates can take the same message. Some of them will have left her and will continue to leave her. So I think it's interesting. But
all the way in the aisle. Yes.
Yeah. He talks about it as an expansion of Medicare, and he specifically addresses a lot of the administrative costs. So, but let me ask you this. You're asking me to defend the Canadian system, but let me tell you something about what folks are saying about the possibility of something in the United States. And there's a woman named Stephanie Wohlhandler, Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School and a co-founder of Doctors for a National Health Program, or some group such as that. What they're talking about is the administrative costs give you something like $300 billion to work with. You add that to the realities in Nader's case of what he says about the military budget, you've got a lot to work with. I don't know if you realize this, but it's estimated that the amount of money that we put into the military right now is something like $450 billion a year. The war in Iraq, you add another $150, $160 billion. You're at 55% of your budget, your national budget, every tax dollar. And the Democrats right now, who want you to believe that you can't do single-payer health care and will cite examples such as yours, will also tell you that they want to increase military spending. Clinton says she wants to increase it. Obama says he wants to increase it and have another 100,000 troops. So, you know, I think that when you've got medical experts in the United States familiar with the system here telling you that it could be done and work effectively, I think we got to look at that and listen to it. Well, first off, don't you think it's interesting, though, that Kerry and Clinton and other Democrats thought this was bad? One thing that your notes will tell you about the energy bill that I didn't even bring up was that it had particularly strong subsidies and tax breaks for the nuclear industry. Isn't that right? And they were the big winners. And the New York Times has written stories about something very interesting, which is that Obama can talk about not taking money from political action groups, but are you aware that it's extremely well documented that he's taken over $250,000 from executives from this industry? Yeah. You leave me your email address, I'll respond. I'll get you the numbers. Because it's one of the, in some cases it was incredible. Even in committees, there were executives from certain oil companies that weren't even arguing in favor of the tax breaks that were given to them. They weren't even trying to get these things. That's how eager U.S. senators were to give those breaks. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question is, what would my administration do, or our administration, Nader Gonzalez, do to protect the American people from terrorism? I think the first thing is that you'd have to engage in a different kind of foreign policy. And I think that you would have to do something about having 800 military bases around the world and quit with the rhetoric about how we've been attacked because people hate freedom or hate our notions of liberty or what have you. I mean, I think that's really perpetuating a extremely simplistic idea of the world. And it's true that there are going to be times when different countries in the world emerge out of dictatorial regimes differently, you know, in different historic moments. There's different kinds of leadership that can usher in democracy, etc. But I think it's a mistake to engage in foreign policy where you're looking at private corporate interests dictating whether or not you want to prop up a dictatorial regime and then change your mind when suddenly, you know, you're not going to be able to get whatever oil reserves you want from a particular country. I mean, that doesn't work. We know that. The other thing I would say is, you know, I think that the United States would have a lot greater standing in the world if we looked at something like the United Nations and tried to bring greater democracy to the Security Council and some of the decision-making around that, and not act like, you know, we've got to make all the decisions or veto decisions, et cetera, like that. Well, I think it's a very interesting fight that's going on in the left right now. I think the big issue is we haven't figured out what we're going to do with the waste. We haven't figured out what you do in terms of nuclear energy as it relates to issues of national security and terrorism. And you're talking about an experiment in France that is, I mean, have you been, you know, how large is this country that we're going to suddenly decide we're going to go down this path? I think it's very dangerous and reckless if we haven't dealt with these other issues. Well, I think you know, Greenpeace is one of many organizations out there that is having a turnaround on the issue. But I don't think that any of the problems that existed years ago have been resolved. I think what you've got is a very concerted public relations campaign right now, telling you that it's good, telling you that it's safe, telling you that it's done in France. Isn't it interesting that the same regime that wants you to look at that is also telling you not to look at democracy experiments in other countries related to election reform? We go to Iraq and we're going to put together their system of democracy and we do proportional representation, but we won't do it here, you know? Yeah, but let's talk about it. No, but I mean, let's discuss it. I wanted to focus on Democrats when I walked in the room because I assume the majority of people here are Democrats and probably Clinton or Obama supporters. I don't want John McCain to be the President of the United States, but you know what? I don't want Senator Obama or Senator Clinton to be the President either. And I think that that's where we're coming from. Now, there's some things about the Republican rhetoric that we find quite offensive. For instance, this idea that McCain puts out there about a perpetual war and what have you. But if you listen to the rhetoric carefully, you know, we've been in Cuba since 1898. We've been in Korea since the Korean conflict. We've been in Europe since World War II. I mean, we've generally stayed places where we have participated or engaged in that kind of activity. And I would say to you that George Bush's policies that we all abhor in this room could only occur because of the votes of Democrats. And so I do feel very strongly that there should be an accounting, because I think what you hear much stronger out there, I certainly feel it, is people suggesting that, and I've heard people say this directly, that the war in Iraq is Ralph Nader's fault. I mean, I think that that's pretty, outrageous. Well, I think Nader would certainly agree with you on the first point, which is there are too many variables at play to just blame, to just pick one of them. And there were probably about 7 or 8 candidates on the ballot in Florida, in addition to Bush and Gore in 2000, that got enough votes to be the margin, 250, whatever votes it was. What I try to do when I talk about it is not that I think Nader cost Gore the election, but rather than fighting with people over that issue, I just say, okay, let's step to the next issue, which is if you think that, what are you doing about it? And what can be done about it? And regardless of whether or not Nader impacted the outcome, we need majority elections anyway because it's better democracy. And I think that that's really very important. What was the second thing you said? Oh, I don't think of instant runoff voting as something to favor third parties or more progressive parties. I see it as favoring a majority outcome. In some cases, it might favor third parties. In other cases, it might not. I mean, it might not favor them at all. But it will get you a better sentiment in declaring a winner, which is going to be somebody that got a majority of the vote.
Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you. Thanks.